Heinz Guderian stood at the window of his command bunker, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame as he watched the endless columns of German tanks rolling eastward across the Ukrainian steppe. The greatest tank commander in military history believed himself destined to crush what he called the primitive Soviet war machine. Stalin, in Guderian's mind, was nothing more than a Georgian peasant who had stumbled into power, commanding hordes of backward soldiers with obsolete equipment. The German Panzer mastermind had already conquered Poland in weeks, demolished France in mere months, and now set his sights on the ultimate prize, Moscow. Yet within 18 months, this same contemptuous attitude would lead to the most catastrophic defeat in German military history. With over 300,000 of his finest soldiers lying frozen in the rubble of Stalingrad. The origins of Guderian's fatal overconfidence traced back to his revolutionary military theories, developed during the interwar period. Born in 1888 to a Prussian military family, Guderian had witnessed the devastating trench warfare of World War I and emerged convinced that future conflicts would be won through speed, mobility, and concentrated armor. While other generals remained fixated on static defensive lines, Guderian pioneered the concept of Blitzkrieg, lightning war that would punch through enemy lines with coordinated tank spearheads, supported by dive bombers and motorized infantry. His theories weren't merely academic, they had been tested and proven devastatingly effective across Europe. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Guderian's 99th Army Corps demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of modern armored warfare. His panzer divisions carved through Polish defenses like a hot knife through butter, advancing over 140 miles in the first week alone. Traditional cavalry charges by Polish lancers against German tanks became symbols of an old world colliding catastrophically with the new. Within 27 days, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. Crushed between German forces from the west and Soviet forces from the east under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Polish campaign was merely a warm-up for what would follow in France. On May 10, 1940, Guderian's tanks burst through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, catching French commanders completely off guard. The French had spent billions of francs constructing the Maginot Line, a massive fortification system designed to prevent German invasion. Yet Guderian simply went around it, his panzer divisions racing across the Belgian countryside and cutting off the cream of the French army in a massive encirclement. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered, and German tanks were parading down the Champs-Élysées. The speed of the conquest shocked even Hitler himself, who had expected a prolonged campaign lasting months or even years. These stunning victories filled Guderian with supreme confidence in German military, superiority and fatal contempt for his enemy's capabilities. In his personal writings and conversations with fellow officers, he consistently dismissed Soviet forces as poorly equipped, badly trained, and incompetently led. He viewed Stalin as a paranoid dictator who had weakened his own military through massive purges of experienced officers. The Red Army's poor performance during the Winter War against Finland in 1939-1940 seemed to confirm these prejudices. Soviet forces had suffered enormous casualties while struggling to defeat a much smaller Finnish army, reinforcing German beliefs about Slavic military incompetence. Guderian's racist ideology intertwined dangerously with his tactical assessments. Like many German officers, he subscribed to Nazi theories about Slavic racial inferiority, believing that Russians, Ukrainians, and other Eastern European peoples were naturally suited only for slave labor under German rule. This wasn't merely casual prejudice, but a fundamental worldview that shaped military planning. German intelligence estimates consistently underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, military reserves, and fighting capability. They assumed that the Soviet Union, like France and Poland before it, would collapse rapidly once German forces achieved initial breakthrough victories. The German invasion of the Soviet Union codenamed Operation Barbarossa, began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, with the largest military assault in human history. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers, supported by 3,300 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, launched simultaneous attacks across an 100-mile front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Guderian commanded Panzer Group 2, spearheading Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow. His forces included the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies, comprising Germany's most experienced tank crews and mechanized infantry units. The initial results seemed to vindicate Guderian's confidence completely. Soviet border defenses crumbled under the German onslaught, with entire army groups surrounded and destroyed in massive encirclement battles. At Minsk, German forces captured 324,000 Soviet prisoners. At Smolensk, another 310,000 Red Army soldiers marched into German captivity. Stalin appeared paralyzed by the scale of the disaster, disappearing from public view for over a week, while his forces suffered catastrophic defeats. German propaganda broadcasts proclaimed the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union, and many neutral observers agreed that Moscow would fall before winter. Guderian's tanks raced across the Russian countryside, covering distances that would have been unimaginable during World War I. His advance units reached within 60 miles of Moscow by October 1941, close enough that German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Soviet resistance seemed to be crumbling everywhere, with entire divisions simply melting away before German attacks. Prisoners told German interrogators that Stalin had fled Moscow, that the government was in chaos, that ordinary citizens were preparing to welcome German liberators. Victory appeared within reach, vindication of everything Guderian had believed about German superiority and Soviet weakness. Yet beneath this apparent success, ominous signs were already emerging that contradicted Guderian's fundamental assumptions. Unlike in France or Poland, Soviet forces continued fighting even when surrounded and cut off from supply lines. Instead of surrendering en masse, isolated units often fought to the last man, inflicting unexpected casualties on German forces. Soviet factories were being evacuated wholesale beyond the Ural Mountains, taking vital industrial capacity out of German reach. Most disturbing of all, new Soviet tank designs like the T-34 were proving superior to German Panzer models, with thicker armor and more powerful guns than German intelligence had predicted. The Soviet T-34 tank represented everything wrong with German pre-war intelligence assessments. This revolutionary design combined sloped armor that deflected German shells, a powerful 76-meter gun that could destroy any German tank, and mechanical reliability that allowed extended operations in harsh conditions. German tank crews discovered to their horror that their 37mm anti-tank guns, effective against Polish and French armor, simply bounced off T-34 hulls like ping-pong balls. Panzer commanders, who had grown accustomed to easy victories, now found themselves outgunned and out-armored by supposedly primitive Soviet equipment. Winter arrived early in 1941, bringing temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. German forces, expecting a quick campaign completed before cold weather, lacked adequate winter equipment. Soldiers stuffed newspapers into their uniforms for insulation while their weapons froze solid. Tank engines required hours of warming before they would start, and many vehicles simply broke down in the extreme cold. Meanwhile, Soviet forces equipped and trained for winter warfare launched devastating counterattacks that drove German armies back from the gates of Moscow. The failure to capture Moscow represented a strategic disaster for German hopes of quick victory. Hitler had assured his generals that the Soviet Union was a house of cards that would collapse once kicked in. Instead, German forces found themselves locked in exactly the type of prolonged, attritional warfare that their military doctrine was designed to avoid. Worse still, Soviet industrial production was actually increasing despite territorial losses. with factories beyond the Urals producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at rates that German intelligence had deemed impossible. Guderian began to recognize the magnitude of German miscalculations, but pride and ideology prevented him from fully acknowledging the implications. In his memoirs, he would later claim that victory had been within reach, if only Hitler had listened to his strategic advice. He blamed the German defeat on political interference rather than fundamental flaws in German assumptions about Soviet capabilities. This refusal to confront uncomfortable truths would prove catastrophic when German forces advanced toward Stalingrad in 1942. The city of Stalingrad held enormous symbolic importance for both sides. Named after the Soviet dictator, it represented the heart of Stalin's industrial revolution, with massive factories producing tanks, weapons, and machinery for the Soviet war effort. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would demonstrate German dominance over the Slavic peoples, while securing vital oil resources in the Caucasus region. For Stalin, defending the city bearing his name became a matter of personal and national survival. German forces approached Stalingrad in August 1942 with renewed confidence following successful summer offensives that had captured vast territories in southern Russia. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, comprised over 270,000 of Germany's finest soldiers, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. These were not green recruits, but battle-tested veterans who had fought across Europe and survived the brutal Russian winter. German officers expected to capture the city within weeks, viewing it as one final obstacle before complete victory in the east. The Battle of Stalingrad began as a conventional military operation, but quickly devolved into the most brutal urban combat in human history. Soviet defenders, following Stalin's order that not one step backward would be permitted, transformed every building into a fortress. German soldiers found themselves fighting for individual rooms, staircases, and basement shelters in a nightmare landscape of rubble and corpses. Snipers picked off unwary soldiers, while artillery bombardments reduced entire city blocks to smoking ruins. Guderian watched from his headquarters as German forces became progressively consumed by the Stalingrad meat grinder. His tactical genius, perfectly suited to rapid maneuver warfare across open terrain, proved utterly irrelevant in the claustrophobic urban environment. German tanks, designed for breakthrough operations, found themselves reduced to expensive pillboxes in narrow streets choked with debris. The very weapons that had conquered Europe became liabilities in close quarters. Combat where a single Soviet soldier with an anti-tank grenade could destroy a Panzer worth hundreds of thousands of marks. Soviet forces demonstrated tactical innovations that caught German commanders completely off guard. Instead of defending fixed positions that could be bypassed, they created fluid defensive zones where small groups of soldiers could appear anywhere, strike hard, then vanish into the rubble. Buildings that German forces captured during the day might be reoccupied by Soviet troops during the night, forcing endless battles for the same objectives. This wasn't the type of warfare described in any German military manual. The psychological impact on German soldiers was devastating. Veterans who had marched triumphantly through Paris now found themselves trapped in a hellscape where death could come from any direction at any moment. Letters home described scenes that seemed pulled from medieval descriptions of hell. Soldiers fighting with knives and bayonets in pitch-black sewers, wounded men freezing to death in buildings too dangerous to evacuate, entire companies wiped out while advancing a few dozen yards. The Wehrmacht war machine that had seemed invincible was literally grinding itself to pieces against Soviet determination. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were implementing one of the most audacious military deceptions in history. While German attention remained fixated on capturing Stalingrad, the Red Army was secretly massing enormous reserves north and south of the city for a massive counteroffensive codenamed Operation Uranus. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 900 tanks were moved into position. While German intelligence remained completely unaware of the threat, the Soviet deception operation demonstrated sophisticated military planning that contradicted every German assumption about Slavic incompetence. Troop movements occurred only at night, with strict radio silence maintained to prevent German interception. Dummy positions were constructed to mislead German reconnaissance, while real forces remained carefully camouflaged. Supply dumps were established in forward positions, and detailed rehearsals ensured that attacking units would know exactly what to do when the offensive began. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive exploded across German lines with devastating effect. Artillery bombardments that lasted for hours pulverized German and Romanian positions, while waves of T-34 tanks burst through defensive lines. Within 4 days, Soviet forces had completely encircled the German 6th Army and portions of the 4th Panzer Army, trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers in what became known as the Stalingrad cauldron. The encirclement represented a complete reversal of German military fortunes. Throughout the early war period, German forces had repeatedly surrounded and destroyed Soviet armies in massive Kesselschlacht operations. Now the tables had turned, with German soldiers finding themselves trapped in exactly the same type of pocket that had previously destroyed their enemies. The psychological impact was staggering, as soldiers who had considered themselves members of a master race realized they were about to become victims of their own military doctrine. Guderian recognized immediately that the Stalingrad encirclement represented a potential catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The trapped forces included not just regular infantry, but elite units that had spearheaded German advances across Europe. These were irreplaceable veteran soldiers whose loss would cripple German military capabilities for the remainder of the war. He urged immediate breakout attempts while German forces retained sufficient strength to punch through Soviet lines. However, Hitler refused to authorize a retreat, insisting that German forces must hold their positions while relief columns fought through to re-establish contact. This decision reflected the same fatal overconfidence that had characterized German planning throughout the Eastern Campaign. Hitler still believed that German military superiority would inevitably triumph over Soviet numerical advantages, refusing to acknowledge that the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The promised relief operation, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, represented Germany's last hope of preventing complete disaster. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most capable German general, assembled a powerful relief force, including the 6th Panzer Division and other elite units. These forces fought desperately to reach the encircled garrison, advancing to within 35 miles of Stalingrad before being stopped by fierce Soviet resistance. Even as the relief operation ground to a halt, Hitler continued refusing to authorize a breakout attempt. German forces trapped in Stalingrad were ordered to hold their positions at all costs, tying down Soviet reserves that could otherwise be used elsewhere. This strategic thinking might have made sense if German forces possessed adequate supplies and defensive positions. Instead, they faced starvation and frostbite while fighting an enemy that grew stronger every day. Conditions inside the Stalingrad pocket deteriorated rapidly as winter tightened its grip. German soldiers subsisted on starvation rations, often consuming horse meat, rats, or anything else remotely edible. Medical supplies ran out, leaving wounded soldiers to suffer without painkillers or antibiotics. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties as temperatures plunged far below zero. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the pocket by air, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns made transport flights increasingly hazardous. The promised air supply operation never came close to meeting minimum requirements. German forces needed at least 500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness, but Luftwaffe transport aircraft rarely delivered more than 100 tons per day. Many flights never reached their destination, shot down by Soviet fighters or forced back by weather conditions. Pilots who did successfully land often found their aircraft destroyed by artillery bombardments. Before supplies could be unloaded, Soviet forces steadily compressed the German perimeter through methodical attacks that wore down defensive strength. The Red Army had learned from earlier defeats, abandoning wasteful frontal assaults in favor of carefully coordinated operations that maximized Soviet advantages in artillery and manpower. German strongpoints were subjected to massive bombardments before being stormed by fresh troops, many equipped with submachine guns, ideally suited for close-quarters combat. By January 1943, German resistance was beginning to collapse. Soldiers who had once conquered Europe now fought desperately for survival in frozen ruins, knowing that relief was impossible and surrender meant probable death in Soviet prison camps. Many units simply disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their positions to search for food or warmth. Officers who tried to maintain discipline found themselves commanding empty positions as their men either died or deserted. The final Soviet assault began on January 10, 1943, with a massive artillery bombardment that shattered what remained of German defensive lines. Red Army forces advanced rapidly through the pocket, splitting German forces into smaller and smaller fragments. Field Marshal Paulus, promoted by Hitler in a final desperate gesture, found himself commanding nothing but scattered groups of starving, frostbitten soldiers who lacked ammunition, medical supplies, or hope of survival. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered along with the southern portion of the trapped garrison. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days before also capitulating, ending the most catastrophic defeat in German military history. Of the approximately 250,000 Axis soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home from Soviet captivity. The remainder died in the fighting, succumbed to disease and starvation, or perished in prison camps. The magnitude of the Stalingrad disaster sent shockwaves throughout the German military establishment. This wasn't merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe that destroyed the myth of German invincibility. Elite units that had taken years to train and equip were completely annihilated, while massive quantities of weapons, vehicles, and equipment fell into Soviet hands. More importantly, the defeat demonstrated that German military doctrine was fundamentally flawed when applied against a determined enemy with adequate resources. Guderian's reaction to the Stalingrad catastrophe revealed the depth of German miscalculations about their enemies. In his private correspondence and later memoirs, he continued to blame the defeat on Hitler's political interference rather than acknowledging fundamental problems with German strategic thinking. He insisted that proper military leadership could have achieved victory, refusing to confront the possibility that German assumptions about Soviet capabilities had been completely wrong from the beginning. The truth was far more damaging to German pride than Guderian was willing to admit. Soviet forces had not only matched German military effectiveness, but had actually surpassed it in crucial areas. The Red Army that fought at Stalingrad demonstrated tactical sophistication, logistical competence, and strategic planning that exceeded German capabilities. This wasn't the primitive peasant army that German propaganda had described, but a modern military force commanded by competent professionals. Stalin, the Georgian peasant whom Guderian had dismissed so contemptuously, had overseen a military transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. The Soviet Union, that entered World War II with obsolete equipment and decimated officer corps, had evolved into a military superpower capable of defeating the finest European armies. This transformation occurred despite losing millions of soldiers and vast territories, proving that German intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong about Soviet resilience and adaptability. The industrial dimension of Soviet success was perhaps even more impressive than battlefield victories. While German production remained constrained by resource shortages and strategic bombing, Soviet factories beyond the Urals were producing weapons and equipment at unprecedented rates. By 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded German output by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1, while aircraft manufacturing showed similar disparities. The primitive Soviet economy had actually outproduced the industrial might of occupied Europe. Soviet technological innovations also contradicted German assumptions about Slavic inferiority. The T-34 tank remained superior to most German designs throughout the war, while Soviet artillery, aircraft and small arms often matched or exceeded German equivalents. Soviet engineers and scientists, supposedly inferior to their German counterparts, had created weapons systems that German forces respected and feared. The Katyusha rocket launcher, in particular, became a symbol of Soviet industrial and technological capability. The human cost of German arrogance extended far beyond the Stalingrad casualties. The Eastern Front consumed over 3 million German soldiers, representing the finest military manpower that Germany possessed. These weren't just statistics, but experienced officers, skilled technicians, and trained specialists whose loss crippled German military effectiveness for the remainder of the war. Many units that fought at Stalingrad had combat records stretching back to Poland and France, representing irreplaceable institutional knowledge and battlefield experience. German treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians also contributed directly to military defeat. Racist ideology convinced German leaders that Slavic peoples could be brutalized without consequence, leading to policies of deliberate starvation and systematic murder. Instead of creating collaborative governments that might have welcomed German forces as liberators, Nazi policies guaranteed fanatical resistance from populations that had initially been neutral or even hostile toward Stalin's regime. The partisan warfare that developed behind German lines demonstrated how ideological blindness created military disasters. Instead of governing conquered territories efficiently, German forces found themselves fighting an invisible enemy that struck everywhere and nowhere. Railroad lines were repeatedly sabotaged, supply convoys ambushed, and isolated garrisons overrun by civilian fighters who melted back into the population. Resources that should have been concentrated against the Red Army were instead diverted to combat guerrilla forces that German policies had created. Intelligence failures compounded the effects of ideological prejudice throughout the Eastern Campaign. German assessments consistently underestimated Soviet capabilities while overestimating German advantages, leading to strategic decisions based on wishful thinking rather than objective analysis. The failure to anticipate Soviet industrial mobilization, the underestimation of Red Army reserves, and the complete surprise achieved by the Stalingrad counteroffensive all reflected systematic intelligence. Problems that stemmed from racist assumptions about enemy capabilities. The strategic consequences of Stalingrad extended far beyond the immediate military effects. German allies, particularly Romania, Hungary and Italy, began questioning their commitment to Nazi Germany after witnessing the destruction of supposedly invincible German forces. Neutral nations that had been considering joining the Axis began moving toward the Allied camp. Most importantly, the defeat convinced Stalin that Germany could be completely defeated, leading to demands for unconditional surrender that eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace. The psychological impact on German soldiers and civilians was equally devastating. The army that had conquered most of Europe in just 3 years was revealed to be vulnerable, even defeatable, by enemies that Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed as inferior. Letters from the front described conditions that contradicted official claims about German success, while casualty lists grew longer despite promises of imminent victory. The myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed through early war successes, crumbled in the ruins of Stalingrad. Guderian's post-war writings reveal a man unwilling to confront the full implications of German defeat. He continued to maintain that German military doctrine was fundamentally sound. that German soldiers were superior to their opponents, and that defeat resulted from political interference rather than strategic miscalculations. This refusal to acknowledge reality reflected the same psychological blindness that had led to disaster in the first place. The broader lessons of Stalingrad extended far beyond military tactics to questions of leadership, ideology, and strategic thinking. German defeat resulted not from tactical errors or equipment failures, but from fundamental misconceptions about their enemies and themselves. The racist ideology that convinced Germans they were fighting inferior. Opponents prevented objective assessment of Soviet capabilities while fostering the strategic overconfidence that led directly to military catastrophe. Modern military historians recognize Stalingrad as the turning point of World War II, the moment when German defeat became inevitable rather than merely possible. The battle demonstrated that ideological prejudice could overcome tactical competence, that strategic miscalculation could negate operational excellence, and that underestimating enemies was often more dangerous than any weapon. The 300,000 German soldiers who died in the Stalingrad campaign paid the ultimate price for their leaders' arrogance and blindness. The contrast between Guderian's pre-war confidence and post-battle reality serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers inherent in military overconfidence. The man who had revolutionized armored warfare through his tactical innovations was ultimately defeated not by enemy tanks or superior generalship, but by his own inability to recognize the true nature of the conflict he was fighting. His dismissal of Stalin as a primitive peasant reflected a broader failure of German strategic thinking that would prove fatal to Nazi ambitions. The Stalingrad campaign revealed that modern warfare required not just tactical brilliance but strategic wisdom, cultural understanding, and above all, the intellectual humility to assess enemies accurately rather than through the distorting lens of ideological prejudice. Guderian possessed the first quality in abundance but lacked the others completely, a combination that transformed him from history's greatest tank commander into the architect of his own nation's most catastrophic military defeat. The 300,000 German soldiers who perished at Stalingrad became symbols of the ultimate price paid for strategic arrogance and ideological blindness. Their sacrifice achieved nothing except to demonstrate that even the most sophisticated military machine in history could be destroyed by leaders who mistook their prejudices for strategic insights. In the end, Guderian's contempt for primitive Stalin proved to be the very weakness that Stalin exploited to achieve complete victory over Nazi Germany.